Hey everybody. Hope this is finding you very well. Today we want to talk a little bit about Module 29, and we're going to get started here at first with just a quick review of interest rates and inflation, because it's going to be an important topic to be covered a little bit later. Just a quick reminder, when we're thinking about interest rates and how this relates to borrowing, just to kind of bring it back to the money market that we've been talking about within Unit 4. When we think about interest rates are really the amount of money that you are going to make if you're lending money, or the other way to think about it, the amount of money that you have to pay, what you have to pay to borrow money. And so if I were to ask you, hey, if you'll lend me $100 and I'm going to go ahead and pay you $200 back, that might sound initially appealing, but obviously you want to think about how long is it before you actually get that money paid back. 30 years from now, you might not really want that 30 or that $100 extra, because it might be hard to find me. So if the nominal interest rate is 10%, and the inflation rate is 15%. How much is your real interest rate? This is a little bit of review. We talked about this a little bit earlier. When we start thinking about this stuff, you can actually start thinking about this by looking at some basic math here. So if you have your real interest is going to be your nominal interest rate minus your expected inflation. When you actually go about and you try and look at this kind of a problem, you can see that if the nominal rate's at 10% and your inflation is sitting at 15%, your real interest rate in this case would actually be -5%. You'd be foolish to lend out the money at 10% if you expected inflation to be 15. If you were hoping to borrow money, though, you're getting free money here. This is a no-brainer. You should definitely be doing it if that were the case. And you can see these equations are inverses of one another. It's the same equation written in opposite ways. So we're going to go ahead and keep moving forward. As we look at something like this, if you lend out $100 with a 20% interest rate, your nominal amount of interest you're going to earn there is, of course, $20. 20% of $100, you're going to make 20%. You get that extra $20, you're going to get your original 100 plus 20 more back at the end of that year. However, when you think about your real interest rate in this case is only 5%. Because remember, that $120 that you have can't purchase the same amount of goods that your original $100 could purchase plus 20 more dollars. With inflation now, this $120 is worth less. It's still worth more than the original 100, but it's only 5% more. And so what you want to think about, if you're borrowing money, if you're lending money, you want to think about, what is that money being paid back? Is that money that you're getting back at the end worth more? And you don't want it to be worth just the same. You want it to be worth quite a bit more, because again, you're supposed to make money on this transaction if you're the lender. Okay. So if you look at another example, if you were to lend out $100 with 10% interest, you would be paid back $110. If prices are expected to go up 20%, though, when you get paid that $110 back, you actually have lost money in this transaction. You've lost purchasing power, would be the way that you'd say it, right? $110 is nothing to scoff at, but that purchasing power isn't as strong. Your original $100, if you've just held on to the money, should in theory be worth actually $120. And so you've actually created negative purchasing power with that transaction. What we're going to be looking at today in Module 29 is actually more specifically something called the loanable funds market. And we want to be able to identify where loans actually come from. And of course, the answer to this question, all loans come from savings. You can't have a loan issued to someone if someone somewhere doesn't have the money to actually loan them. So someone has to have saved for someone else to get out a loan. And that basic concept helps you understand what this graph looks like. So as you can see here, this graph shows the demand and supply for loans in an economy with real interest rates. Okay, so you're looking at the number of loans and the real interest rates. And of course, as everything else in economics seems to have, you can look at a supply and demand curve. So in this case, we have the demand that borrowers are putting that want loans, and you have the supply that's created by lenders, those people that are willing to lend out their savings. And you can imagine there is some point, an equilibrium point, where the number of loans being issued by lenders is equal to the number of loans that are being demanded by borrowers. And there's a particular interest rate, equilibrium interest rate, where you're going to actually see that meet. And so you get this equilibrium. By now, we've been doing this for a long time. This should be pretty self-explanatory. I do want to emphasize these concepts here. So all of these projects over here are projects that have rates of return that are actually greater than the equilibrium interest rate. This project here, there's one particular loan that's like the very last loan that's actually granted. It's the very last dollar borrowed. This last dollar gets spent, but all these other guys are money that's borrowed as well. Okay, now they're all going to borrow at that one rate, but as the rates were to change, they would continue to borrow. And at the same time, any project that is below that equilibrium interest rate actually doesn't get funded. These are people that are saying, you know what, I don't think that my business is going to make money with interest rates that are that high, so I'm going to choose to hold off on that new restaurant. I'm going to choose to hold off on that particular issue. Investors or lenders actually have the ability to loan out money. And when they're going ahead and they are thinking about how they want to actually loan out their money, the lenders down here, these people that are willing to accept low interest rates, will continue to loan out that money. There are also lenders that are actually up here willing to lend out those interest rates because the lenders are going to make more and more and more money at those higher and higher rates. And I'm sorry, I think I misspoke before. At these low interest rates, the lenders are saying there's no value down here. And so when you have these extremely low interest rates, few investors will actually give up the money. They would rather do something else than issue a loan. It's too risky in many cases if you're not going to make higher interest rates. So you do need to know what is actually going to change these supply and demand curves for the loanable funds. And so you want to make sure that somewhere you're recording this or snapping a quick picture of this. Those things are going to increase the demand for loanable funds. As you think about these should make sense. If you have a belief that business opportunities are more likely to succeed moving forward, that belief would make you more willing to take out some loans, to go ahead and borrow some money. So all these things, think about it from the borrower's perspective. What would make people more willing to borrow money? More government borrowing, deficit spending, is actually going to increase the demand for loanable funds. Remember, when the government does that deficit spending, they're borrowing money. So the government itself is actually borrowing the money. And so, when President Biden passes a stimulus package through Congress, as is just happening as we speak, this is something where the government's going to pledge to spend, I believe, $1.9 trillion. We don't have enough tax dollars, so they're going to have to start borrowing from other sources, including private sources like you and me. We do want to make sure that we're also aware of this thing that's called crowding out. The crowding out is this concept that as the government goes ahead and spends money, it actually prevents private spending in some cases. So in this particular case, if the government's taking out loans, it's actually meaning that there will be less loanable funds available for you and I. And so you're not going to see quite the same impact that you might initially expect when the government's spending some of that money. So what does that look like on the curve? So if the government were to increase their deficit spending, the demand for government loans is going to create an overall increase in demand for loans. So you're going to see that increase to the right. And as you can see, our equilibrium, the quantity of loans is going to actually increase to Q1. We're going to see the real interest rate that's being charged for those loans also increase. And what you can see in this graph, you can actually see and show crowding out. So what you're seeing, this original demand is the demand that's exhibited by private borrowers. This new demand is private plus public plus the government. So the difference here, this is your government spending over here, and this is what we would define as your private borrowing. And so what you can see, the old amount of private borrowing was all the way here, this Q loans. This new meeting point would be here, meaning that your private loans are actually diminishing, even though overall there are more loans being taken out. So that government borrowing is crowding out. That's how you'd show that on a graph. We also want to keep in mind that the supply of loanable funds can change as well. You can see this with changes in savings behavior. So one of those examples would be if people are expecting a recession, they'll actually change their spending habits. They'll actually begin to save more in anticipation for some tough times ahead. As people save more, remember, when you save money, that increases the supply of loanable funds. So it actually allows there to be more people that will be able to borrow money. We also can see increases in capital inflows, which would be investors from other countries that are bringing money into our country. As more foreigners will invest capital in the United States, it increases the ability to go ahead and get those loans. Now, one thing that you definitely want to make sure you remember, I don't know that this talked about in the book in Module 29, but we definitely want to cover this in Unit 4, is the Fisher effect. So the Fisher effect is this idea that the expected real interest rate is actually going to go unchanged when we start thinking about expected future inflation. So when we have future inflation that is expected, it's actually not going to affect the real interest rate at the time. And the reason we can see this is for this kind of double thing that's happening. And we'll walk you through it, and then we'll show you in a graph here in just a moment. So if expected future in places, two things actually happen. So the first thing is borrowers are going to increase their demands for funds. So think about it like this. Borrowers are going to want to borrow more money because they realize that in the future, if there's greater inflation, they're going to be paying back those loans that are actually being paid back with less valuable money. So if the money started out, you borrowed $100 today, instead of spending $110 to pay it back, if you expect inflation to be even higher, let's say it's 20% inflation, well, that means that money you're paying it back with is even less valuable. And lenders see it the opposite way. Lenders will actually decrease the supply of funds. So they're expecting that they're going to make less money on that loan. And so they're less willing to supply those funds. But because this increase in demand is offset by a decrease in supply, what you overall see is a change in real interest rate that actually is no change whatsoever. The real interest rate actually stays basically the same, plus the expected inflation rate. Now, this only works for expected future inflation. So this is what it looks like on a graph. You see the demand increase over here. You see the supply increase, the supply decrease in loans over here. And you see this increase in the real interest rate. However, that interest rate increase is going to match what is actually happening with the change in inflation. So that is going to match your expected inflation rate. And so your real interest rate ultimately ends up being the same. Okay? So that's what we're looking at. So remember, the R doesn't stand for real interest rate. The R stands for interest rate. This column over here is the nominal interest rate when we're looking at the Fisher effect. Okay? And that's the simple concept that we're seeing. Like I said, that's expected inflation. All right. So that brings us to the end here. Hopefully you found this to be a helpful video and can continue your learning. Remember, this should be the very end of Unit 4. We'll wish you the best of luck as you get ready for your exam. Thanks, everybody.